Okay, so this is going to be the audio lecture for the drug resistance, antibiotic resistance. And so one article I would highly recommend you looking at, and more specifically the video. It's an article that's found on Smithsonian.com, but also if you just Google megaplate E. coli, last year there was a group that published about the evolution of antibiotic resistance in E. coli, and so what they did is they took this very large agar slab, so instead of being a circular plate, it was a square, and they had different concentrations of antibiotic, and then you could actually watch the E. coli as it evolved and became selected for antibiotic resistance. So really kind of nice link to what we're going to be talking about. Really nice visual in the time-lapse video. So antibiotic resistance is a growing problem. So antibiotics are being overused, and so when we talk about antibiotics being overused, we want to keep in mind that we're talking about all antibiotics that are used. And so antibiotics are not just used for human medicine, but they're also used in veterinary medicine, or more specifically with livestock. Okay, so veterinary medicine would include, you know, pets, so your personal pet, whether that's your dog, your cat, but also would include livestock, and a lot of times those aren't actually being treated by actual veterinarians. The farmers themselves are treating the animals that are producing food for us. And so previously what was happening was that animal feed actually was having antibiotics put into it, so it was meant to prevent disease, but all the animals were being exposed to antibiotics because they're eating the feed, and that obviously creates an issue because that would actually select for antibiotic resistance within the livestock population. And work done out of MIT has also shown that antibiotic resistance can pass from food to animals or to humans when we consume those foods. So that can actually accelerate that process. When we look at antibiotic use, 80% of antibiotic use comes from livestock veterinary medicine. Only 20% of antibiotic use is actually in human medicine. So again, when we look at the issue of antibiotic resistance, though changes in human medicine are really important and can have an effect in a beneficial way, we also want to make sure that we're looking at policies with livestock, agricultural, veterinary medicine, because with 80% of antibiotics being used in that setting, it's going to have an even more profound effect. Okay, there are a number of different bacteria that do have antibiotic resistance, so it's actually more abnormal for them not to. So there's several different mechanisms which can lead to antibiotic resistance, and so one of the mechanisms is an altered target. So we have to keep in mind the antibiotic to work has to bind to something to have an effect, right? So there's we had looked at different ways antibiotics work, whether that's by disrupting cell membrane, whether that's inhibiting protein synthesis, inhibiting nucleic acid synthesis. And so for each one of these mechanisms, the antibiotic has to bind to something to have an effect. And so if we're looking at something along the lines of a, doxycycline that's going to inhibit protein synthesis, if the ribosome is altered, right, because of a random mutation, the ribosome isn't the same exact shape, same exact sequence, that could then lead to your antibiotic not binding to it. Well, that gives survival to those organisms that have this altered ribosome, right? So again, we can alter the target. The second mechanism is that the antibiotic can actually be degraded, and so this happens because the bacteria would have an enzyme that actually will deactivate the antibiotic. And so we see this with the penicillin. So there are bacteria that have penicillin aces, so ACE enzymes that deactivate penicillin. So what they do is they actually cleave the beta-lactam ring that's found on penicillins and cephalosporins. And when they cleave that ring, the penicillin, the cephalosporin, is no longer able to function. It's not able to inhibit cell wall synthesis repair. Okay. Next, the third mechanism is we can actually modify the antibiotic, and so the modified version of the antibiotic is no longer active functional. The fourth one, which I think of as like cartoon represent, kind of Three Stooge kind of event going on, is where we can actually pump the antibiotic out of the cell. So in order for the antibiotic to work, for some, they need to get inside the cell. So if you're going to inhibit protein synthesis or nucleic acid synthesis or vitamin synthesis, you need to get inside the cell in order to function, because you need to be able to bind to your target inside the cell. Well, bacteria can develop drug pumps, and so they actually will pump the antibiotic out as soon as it gets in. So obviously some energy is being invested by the bacteria to do this, but this allows the bacteria to survive, because if the antibiotic is not inside the cell, it can't have a function. So again, I think of this like Three Stooge, cartoon with like the antibiotic getting in and then being pulled back out, antibiotic getting in and getting pulled back out by these pumps. So these are the four different mechanisms of how antibiotic resistance can arise. So the next couple slides just go into a little bit more detail and give you examples, some of which I already discussed. So I will kind of skip over these slides and just allow you to either read the slides on your own or read the information that's in your textbook. So same thing here. So we've already talked about how the modified antibiotic would be inactive, and also about the pumps that can actually pump the antibiotic outside of the cell. So as I mentioned, drug resistance develops when selection is put upon the bacteria. And so, if we were to never use an antibiotic, we would never have antibiotic resistance. Now, we'd also have pathogens that are lethal, actually killing people, right? So once a patient or organism takes the antibiotic, you're killing the bacteria that are susceptible to the antibiotic. And when you do that, what is left is the bacteria that is not susceptible or resistant. Those are the ones that now are able to populate the patient, the person who had taken the antibiotic. And again, the antibiotics won't work against it, so now you have these resistant bacteria present. Second part is how do we fight drug resistance? And so one of the key ways to fight drug resistance is to make sure that we limit antibiotic use. And so antibiotics are a wonderful tool in fighting bacterial infections, but when we do use them, we select for resistance. And so in cases where an antibiotic is not warranted, it's better not to use one. Making sure that we're using antibiotics correctly. And so if we have a viral infection, taking an antibiotic will only cause drug resistance. It will not make you feel better. You would need the correct antimicrobial, and that would be an antiviral. Making sure that we're removing antibiotics use before disease occurs. And again, this is where in agricultural and veterinary practices we see this quite a bit. And the USDA has actually stepped in and made a policy that the antibiotics actually have to be removed from food. Antibiotics now at a number of grain stores and such are not available over the counter, so prescriptions are needed for those. So we're making the right steps in fighting drug resistance. It's just getting everyone to buy into it. I've always been able to give my animals antibiotics before they were sick, and that prevented them from being sick. That's not really the best strategy. Also, using combination drugs can be extremely beneficial because the bacteria in the resistance can develop ways to go around pathways, and so by doing multiple drugs, this helps to make sure that regardless of any resistance to one antimicrobial or one antibiotic, that if you do 2 antibiotics that are a combination, that you're more likely to get the bacteria that's actually resistant. We also have combinations like augmentin. Augmentin has a acid chemical in it that actually deactivates the penicillinases, so that the amoxicillin that's in augmentin would actually work. So again, these combination treatments we're seeing helps prevent those drug-resistant bacteria from actually surviving and passing on and growing and dividing and causing an infection, further infection.